So, welcome to the Free World podcast. I have a guest who I've been trying to get as a guest for a very long time, David Pakman. Maybe you can briefly introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? What is your favorite soup?
Oh, well, my favorite soup, just because it's you, one of my favorite soups is this salmon soup with dill that I had in Helsinki when I was last there. I don't remember the name of it, but it was phenomenal.
I think it's called salmon soup.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. Well,
that's
I'm David Pakman. I have a US based, I guess what I would call a progressive talk show, podcast, YouTube channel, independent. I started producing it when I was in college, and it helped me avoid ever having to get a real job. And that's sort of how I landed where I am now.
you've been doing it for like 20 years, right?
That's right. It's disturbing to acknowledge that.
All right. Sorry about that. I think I'm gonna dive into the deep end directly. Like, what the hell is going on in the United States right now?
I wish I knew. I mean, the funny thing, not funny, scary. This week on my show, I found myself saying things like, our Constitution guarantees, and then I stop myself and I say, wait a second, what is it? What does it mean that it guarantees? Does it really guarantee if you can just ignore it? If you can ignore court orders, if you can deport people without due process? So, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this is a crisis in the direction of authoritarianism. I stop short of saying this is a dictatorship because it's not right now, at least not nominally. But we're starting to see attacks on free press, ignoring due process, attacks on institutions. There's an attempt now to remove nonprofit status from Harvard University. It's happening on every front right now. And if you are a scholar of 20th century history, you start to see some pretty scary things starting to happen.
Yeah, and I think some academics have already relocated to Canada, for example, because it's not they think that it's not safe to stay in the United States, and it's like it's. I think everybody has been surprised how quickly this all has happened. And I think that's one of the strategies is to just do it like very quickly, so people don't have time to kind of go through and analyze what's going on. But like when we look at the first 100 days or so of Trump's reign, what is the most alarming thing for you? What do you think?
I
What is the
don't
most
think there's
yeah.
one most alarming thing. I think it's everything under the umbrella of autocracy and ignoring democracy and the will of the people, legal court orders. So everything under that umbrella, I think, is what's most concerning. And you often hear this phrase about how, well, they came for this next group, and so here's the following group that now has to worry. And a lot of people say, oh, that's a slippery slope. I just did a story on my podcast today about a naturalized American citizen like me. I was naturalized. I'm from Argentina. I was naturalized here. A naturalized American citizen who was returning from Canada and was detained for 5 hours, coerced into giving access to his phone, which contained privileged information. He was a lawyer, so it was privileged information with his clients, and ultimately allowed back into the country. But it's no longer undocumented immigrants who have committed crimes. It's no longer just undocumented immigrants. It's no longer just permanent residents. And I asked a congressman today, am I next? If I go visit my sister in Canada where she lives, am I the next person that will be subjected to this? And who can say no at this point?
But like, do you feel safe in the United States right now?
I feel safe. This may be naive and it may be self-preservation, but I do feel safe day to day in terms of my immediate community, my ability to access a lawyer if I need one. The police is still going to come to my defense if I'm in trouble, local police. That's the way it feels right now. The dynamics with federal law enforcement at this point is much more of a question mark. I just don't know where it's going.
Have you seen any? Have you? have you seen any signs? Has there been any kind of threatening communication towards you? If I remember correct, you've met Joe Biden, right?
Yes.
So have you gotten any emails or anything like messages or anything like that? Just you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I
You
mean
know
just
what you're saying from antagonists or from people warning me?
both,
Both.
either.
Okay. I always get messages from antagonists, so that hasn't
Mm.
changed.
Ah,
But I did get a warning from a couple of lawyers in Washington, D.C., who said, we don't know what Trump's going to try to do. But most likely, if this administration tried to target opposition media like you, it wouldn't be criminal charges. It would be, let's get the IRS to audit you and put you into 3 years of expensive accounting hell. Let's look at deprioritizing you on social media. What lawyers have said is that would probably be the approach, not trumped up criminal charges.
yeah, because they are strong supporters of free speech, so they cannot really take that route. Say they cannot attack what you say, but they can attack your, I don't know, your company, or like how you operate, and so on. So I mean, I think there are ways to do it, and I wanted to ask this because I've been a strong opponent of Russian, the Kremlin. So there's a lot of they have a lot of stuff in their toolbox that they can do to kind of I don't know, harass people. So I'm just interested because to me it almost seems like the United States is moving towards that kind of system, authoritarian system, where they're creating this illusion of a great leader, like they did like 15 years ago with Putin. They created this image of a great leader, and now seems to be doing the same with Trump, with the I think the latest thing was the health inspection where he was built like a, I don't know, quarterback in NFL. So it's just like it seems like almost like North Korean or Russian system where you just try to create this I don't know, an idol or a godlike figure who's leading the country, a cult maybe. But I don't know. Do you see this kind of characteristics in the U.S. right now?
I do see it. And, in fact, I actually wanted to ask you. I mean, sometimes people ask me, David, would you go to Russia today? And I say, I don't have a delusion of grandeur that Putin is paying attention to what I'm doing. But I would be worried that maybe my long-standing opposition to the Russian regime is known to someone. And I'm not, my point is, I wanted to ask you, as someone who's been on record very much critical of that regime, like, do you go to Russia? Would you go to Russia? Or do you believe for your own safety, it's not a place that makes sense for you to go today?
I would definitely not go to Russia. I wouldn't encourage anybody who's criticizing the Russian government or the Kremlin to go there. And actually, I feel the same about the United States right now. I wouldn't come to United States. There are examples. I think it was maybe a German, or I think a German scholar or academic who tried to go there, who tried to come to the United States for a conference, and then they went through his social media and they found some criticism towards Trump, and that was basically it. He was denied.
Yeah.
So first of all, it could be just a complete waste of money because they just denied entrance, or in the worst case scenario, they could put me in a like ICE detainment, these centers. So I would avoid going to the United States as I would avoid going to Russia right now. So and that is it's so wild to say it. I mean, 3 months ago, I would have called myself crazy, but right now it's the reality we live in, I think.
No, I agree with you. And the risk reward on a lot of these just seems very out of balance. And, I have friends who are in the process of naturalization. They're terrified. I don't know what's going to happen with them. And, one of the other issues we're dealing with here is there is significant confusion, to put it charitably, confusion about what it means to be here legally. So I'll give you like one example. If you come to the US and ask for asylum and are given a court date at which you need to show up at a court, you're here legally. And there's a lot of people who either don't like that or don't understand that. And so with a lot of these deportations, you hear they weren't here legally. There's a difference between not having permanent status and being here as part of the asylum process, awaiting a court date. Now, if you skip the court date, that's a different story. But a lot of the people now that are kind of mixed up in all of this, they may not like that that is a form of legal status, but it is a form of legal status. And if we are a country of laws, you have to respect that.
And is Abrego Garcia the guy who was accidentally sent to a mega prison in El Salvador?
Yeah.
That is just like unbelievable. How does this happen? And now they are doubling down on all this. So they are trying to turn him into a gang member, and there's a restraining orders and so on. Even if you have a restraining order or a parking ticket or whatever parking violation, it's not really a reason to send someone to a mega prison where they probably die, because this guy, he came to the US because he was threatened by these gangs, right? So
Well, it
he's
was
probably not very
determined,
safe there.
a judge determined that sending him to El Salvador could get him killed. That's a prior determination. You know, the wildest thing, I use this term Kafkaesque. There was this incredible Kafkaesque moment in the Oval Office last week where you have the president of the United States meeting with the president of El Salvador. And when they're asked about bringing this individual back to comply with the law, they kind of look at each other and they go, we don't have the power. We just can't do it. Trump says, I can't go into El Salvador and do that. Bukele says, I can't smuggle someone into the United States. And so we're led to believe that two presidents working together couldn't possibly move one man. It's laughable and terrifying.
Yeah, and one of them is the leader of the biggest superpower in the world.
Right.
Probably has some leverage, I would imagine. But there's even been like rumors online that the guy is probably dead already or something, because that's why they say that they cannot do anything. But either way, it is Kafkaesque, and it's a very well put, because it's yeah, it just fits. But I have another question I wanted to ask you is how how do you see Europe right now? How do you like? I'm always interested in how Americans see Europe and how Europeans see America. So how do you see, like, geopolitically, culturally? You've been to Europe, so you kind of know something. But how do you see us right now?
So personally, I look at Europe and I say, what a shame that these great allied countries are now looking at us with skepticism and looking at us and saying, any agreement we come to with the United States is worth very little, because if the wind blows the wrong way or the wrong person puts a tweet on X, the current president will say, I don't like that agreement anymore. It makes us erratic. And so I understand the skepticism of being in business with the United States. Now, personally, I was just in Europe 3.5 weeks, in fact, and everyone I spoke to did not, upon learning that I was visiting from the United States, assume that I was in favor of what is happening here. And of course, as soon as conversation started, and especially in London, where I have an audience, a lot of people recognized me and wanted to talk about it. I jokingly said, there's a reason I'm in London instead of the United States. But I didn't meet any personal antagonism of any kind, the way that, you know, during the Iraq War, for example, there were certainly stories of Americans in France not being treated particularly well. I didn't experience anything like that on a personal level, but everybody I spoke to said, you guys are really having a problem there. It was almost a feeling of pity that I encountered more than anger.
Yeah, I mean, it is it's a tragic situation, because it feels like Trump is holding the whole country hostage right now.
Right.
Uh, but what? How do you see why did Trump become the president? What happened there? What is your take?
I think it's three things altogether. Number one, running as an opposition party has certain advantages. And so I think that the perception about the state of the economy, crime, and immigration as the sort of top three issues. The perception of that under Joe Biden didn't help Joe Biden. Now, I tried to take a more empirical view and say, okay, let's look at the economic metrics. They look okay. Let's look at the state of crime. It's declining, but it sort of doesn't matter, right? What perception is reality to a degree, and it is very empowering to the opposition party, similarly to Trump's mishandling of things during his first term allowed Biden in the opposition to then win in 2020. So I think the strength of being in the opposition is number one. Number two, the Democratic Party sort of was in a fiasco state where I don't think Biden should have even run for re-election. He did, to the extent that I thought he was the best shot rather than having a chaotic primary fight. I said, I think we stick with Biden. After the June 27th debate, which went terribly for Biden, I said, I don't think this is sustainable anymore. And so you had Biden get out, Harris gets in. It's a clumsy campaign. It doesn't really connect with voters. So I think Harris was sort of like problem number two. And then number three, it was in general a Democratic Party that was not really offering a coherent vision. And so it wasn't just Harris who lost. I mean, Democrats lost the Senate, Democrats lost the House of Representatives. That doesn't happen on a fluke. And so I think it's those three things.
But this is something I thought that maybe a few years ago, that Democrats kind of focused too much on Biden, and they weren't building these characters. They weren't building personas that could challenge Trump, and he didn't really have any opposition at any point, because it was just Biden and Trump, and nobody was, because I think and especially in American politics, you have to build these personas, you have to build these powerful characters who are able to, I don't know, they are able to capture audiences and so on. And just I think still Democrats are kind of missing this kind of powerful character who could do this. But what's your take?
I think that that's generally true. You know, I think there's some signs of life in that Senator Bernie Sanders and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been doing in-person rallies in some pretty right-wing areas, including Idaho and other places, and getting massive, massive crowds. And there seems to be a movement sort of starting behind them. Now, Bernie Sanders has made it clear he sees himself as too old to run for president again. He'd be close to 90 years old at the time that the next president would be sworn in. So he's not going to be the nominee, but he could play a major role in supporting whoever will be the nominee. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I don't know what her political future is. She's becoming increasingly skilled politically, and some see her as divisive. But I think the point is, these two individuals aside, there is an enthusiasm for that charismatic presence that Donald Trump has been for the right. And one of the things that Trump did very well, it has to be acknowledged, is in July, August, September, October of last year, he appeared in these long-form, unstructured media environments that were less overtly political, with the kind of like lifestyle programs. And it was an authentic Trump. He lied every few seconds, but it doesn't really matter because he was there. It didn't feel structured. It felt genuine. And it's what used to be the beer test. You know, would you rather have a beer with Bush or Kerry sort of thing in 2004? And the Democratic Party has become quite stiff and risk averse in that way.
Yeah, I mean, Trump on Joe Rogan, that was good for Trump. That was actually very powerful appearance in my view.
Yeah.
Theo Von, like these very they have huge audiences, and especially young people. But you've been on Rogan, right?
I've been on twice.
Can you tell about the experience, the literal experience?
Well, I mean, it was, you know, with all of these things, I think sometimes people have the expectation that it's big fireworks when you do these shows. But the truth is, you know, you show up and you go into a little room that starts getting hotter and hotter because of all of the equipment. and you sit there and talk and try to be coherent for 1, 2, 3 hours. So the actual experience of it is relatively unremarkable. What's interesting, of course, is the reach of these programs. And then, people at my gym who never recognized me before all of a sudden recognize me because they're in Rogan's audience, So I think the reach of these programs is what sometimes, when you're just sitting in a room, you don't realize the scale of some of these shows.
Are you still in contact with Joe?
I am not. And in fact, when my book came out, I've already said this publicly. I wrote to him and I said, I have a book out. I'm coming through Texas. I would love to be on. And I didn't hear back. And it could be that he's too big for me now, which I'm not saying that sarcastically. He might just be too big for me now. It could be that I have criticized Rogan over the last years significantly. And if he still follows my content, which he used to, maybe he saw that and he doesn't want to have me on. Or maybe he just didn't see my message.
Yeah, and also I think his kind of guest list has changed over the years a little bit, maybe towards the right,
I think so.
or well, to me it seems silly to talk about left and right. It's basically the common narrative in the United States. But for example, what is left in Finland is extreme left. There's no really a party that supports this kind of Finnish, the Nordic system. So using this kind of left-right thing as a political spectrum seems silly to me, because I usually talk about liberal, illiberal, or authoritarian these days.
It's
But
interesting. I actually wanted to ask you about that because I've talked to my audience before about how, on the one hand, I need to be understood on my show. And so in a sense, using the terms left and right is still a shorthand in a way for explaining where someone is on the political spectrum. But I don't want to be speaking in code on my show. But at the same time, I tend to favor more the authoritarian libertarian scale, and then the sort of social liberal versus social conservative. And then that gives us a matrix, at least. So like for me, I'm a social liberal, but I am a small L libertarian. And when I say that in the United States, people say, "Oh, you're in the like capital L liber," and I said, "No, no, no, no. I when given the option between authoritarianism and libertarianism, I err on the side of libertarianism. I don't want government involved unless there's a good reason. With healthcare, I think there's a good reason. With education, with building roads. So I think it's much more accurate to think about it as a matrix. But left and right has just become such a prevalent shorthand that sometimes it's hard to make yourself understood if you use different terminology.
and that's the thing. Like in Finland, the Finnish Broadcasting Company, which basically is governmental media house, they use this kind of. So you have four dimensions there, and I think it makes sense. But I think I don't want to underestimate general population, but I think it's just more simple to use left, right, and then if you're in the left, the right is the enemy, and it's black and white. So
Yeah.
it's easier, and but the problem there is it's also more polarizing. So you create these divisions, like, okay, if you are on the left, then the enemy is on the right, and vice versa. So it's a very simplified system that doesn't really work in real life, but it's just something that we are used to, because we have to know the enemy who we want to talk about. So
Yeah.
the woke left is the enemy, or the far right is the enemy. So but I mean, in general, it's more about like yeah, libertarianism, and so yeah, I agree with this kind of four dimensional system. Uh, but again, I'm gonna go back to this Europe versus US, because I want to create tension. Uh, so what do you like about Europe, and what do you dislike? Just could be anything.
So what I'm going to tell you is from personal experience. These are not large critiques of systems necessarily, but personally, what I love about Europe is that culturally, I find that I have much more in common with the average Western European. I've spent quite a bit of time in the UK, in France, in Spain, especially where I have family, Estonia. I've spent time in a lot of different places. Culturally, I find Europe to be far more social than the United States in a lot of ways that I find enjoyable in terms of community, in terms of existing, sort of not in your house, but out kind of in the world. And so that is something I've personally enjoyed significantly when I have visited. What I find more difficult about Europe in my experience is kind of like lowercase b bureaucracy. And this is everything from, dealing with a parking ticket to friends who have wanted to do small renovations to their apartment, that sort of thing. I think that being used to the ease with which you can do most of it in the United States, when my friends in France and Italy and Spain tell me what they go through to remodel their kitchen, for example, I think that would be very difficult. Now, whether that's representative of any bigger problems in Europe, I don't want to overstep and say, because I've not really lived there long term.
Do you agree with the statement that Europe has been freeloading on the US when it comes to security and defense?
Freeloading. No, I mean, my instinct is not to agree with that. I know that Donald Trump has said that Europe's not paying its fair share. I don't know. I mean, what is the fair share? Is it a per capita contribution? I'm not sure. I find that is maybe a little too simplistic an allegation.
Okay, fair enough. Maybe you can tell briefly about your book. I read that it's a New York bestseller. So
It made the New
what
York
is it about? The Echo
bestseller.
Machine, right?
It's called The Echo Machine. There's basically three main ideas of the book that I elaborate. Number one is that Trump is primarily a consequence, and a consequence of a movement of radicalization that started with the civil rights movement in the United States around 1960. And I trace the arc through a number of different steps that include Reagan and Clinton, Bush, and Obama, and really sees Trump as the end result of something rather than as a cause himself. That's point number one. Point number two is that the environment in which that took place is precipitated by a culture that has rejected critical thinking and has embraced pseudo and anti-intellectualism. And I elaborate that. And then number three, that there are some specific issues the US is dealing with that we can look to the rest of the world for ideas about how they can be better dealt with. And we look at 6 or 7 examples in the book, including Denmark, Finland to a degree, Uruguay, and some other places. So those are kind of like the 3 big themes of the book. And in doing that, we talk about a lot of other issues as well.
Okay, and how has the reception been? Have people enjoyed it, or like what kind of feedback have you gotten for the book?
Well, the people buying the book are mostly people who are sympathetic to my way of thinking. So they love it, right? I think the question, of course, is if we were to put this book in front of small business conservatives or members of the Libertarian Party, there's no question that they would push back against some of the ideas in the book. But so far, the book's been out for 3 weeks. The feedback has been amazing, and I've been flattered by the success of the book.
All right, I will put the link to the book to the description so people can check it out. Okay, so we are in this very strange situation in the United States right now, or I think globally, geopolitically, we are in a very strange situation. But when it comes to the United States, is there a way out of this? And if there is, how do you see it?
Do you mean a way out of Trump, a way out of the geopolitical situation?
So maybe I elaborate a bit. So way out of this slippery slope into authoritarianism that is kind of playing out every day. That's at least the way I see it. Like there is it almost seems like the system of checks and balances in the United States is being challenged right now.
Right.
So do you think that the system will hold the old system and if there is a way out of this kind of slippery slope?
So there's basically 3 ways out. Number one is Trump changes his mind and stops doing all of this stuff. Doesn't feel like the very likely path out right now. So we'll kind of put that one to the side. Second path out is that while Trump remains in power, the checks and balances have some power and have some teeth. So when there's a legal judicial order from a court and the Trump administration ignores it, that there's a way to create a real consequence. Is that going to happen? I don't know. I mean, so far, they've gotten away with ignoring legal court orders, and there really haven't been consequences. So the second path out is that there is real recourse and a way to enforce checks, balances, and due process. Number three is that ultimately this movement is voted out. Now, of course, Trump will be term limited at the end of this term, but then the question becomes who kind of takes the torch from Trump, and do they continue in the same direction or not? And does the Republican Party win or does the Republican Party lose? So my trajectory, the way I'm kind of envisioning it is Trump is very unlikely to change. In the short term, I think Democratic elected officials and courts need to find a way to truly hold an administration accountable that just says, we don't care, but fine, check, balance, we don't care. That's the short term. And then the long term is that, of course, this movement needs to be voted out. But to do that, you need to figure out how to recover from what happened in November.
Okay, so there is a way out.
There's a way out.
There are many ways out. Okay, so let's move on to Russia. I really feel like the US, the Trump administration, is fully aligned with Russia right now. Do you agree with this statement?
I would say certainly mostly aligned. And, you know, one of the things about this is I see a lot of the nexus of this alignment, Trump's affinity for authoritarian strongmen who are in certain ways what Trump wants to be, but knows that he isn't. So that has then allowed opportunists and cynics who genuinely have an interest in an alignment with Russia to kind of cling to Trump and ride what for Trump is really a personality-driven affinity at its core. But I'm kind of, in short, yes, that is the way. I mean, certainly when you see Trump saying Ukraine started the war and Zelensky is the dictator, it's hard to see that and say it's not an alignment with Russia. So I would say yes.
Yeah, and if we add on top of that is so Trump is calling Zelensky a beggar, just begging for money. And then when Zelensky said, okay, sell us some Patriot systems and missiles, Trump just says, no, they're not going to sell any weapons to Ukraine. So uh, is Trump abandoning America's biggest allies like Denmark? Denmark probably has been one of the best allies of the United States. They are now threatening annexing Greenland, Canada. I mean, that's they best buddies since forever, threatening with well hostile takeover or annexation. Um, so, like, what's the how do you see the end game here? Do you have any clue what's going on?
So my cautiously optimistic idea is that Trump will back off from some of this bluster with some kind of lie about how everybody capitulated to him. They all came to him, as he likes to say, with tears in their eyes and said, we'll do what you want. It won't be true. But I think that if there's an off ramp here, it's Trump saving face and kind of backing away, but saying, I'm only backing away because they were all so scared they did what I wanted them to do. I think that's the best case scenario right now. Worst case is that these alliances are really damaged in a more permanent way, and that Republicans win again in 2028, and then you get 8 years in a row of antagonism towards our allies. I think that would be the worst case scenario. And then, of course, the in between would be that these alliances fray for the rest of this presidential term, but that the people of these countries understand that this doesn't represent all Americans, as my experiences in Europe recently suggest is possible, and that then hopefully someone a little bit more sane and who understands the importance of this global order is able to rekindle those alliances starting in January of 2029. That's the hope.
Yeah, I mean, if we see maybe a more traditional Republican coming into power, or just any Democrat. Basically, it's basically the first one. The first month will probably be trying to rebuild these alliances and just like saying, "The sorry, that wasn't us. Now we are back," and so on. So, but again, do you see this as a weakness of the democratic system? Because like you have 4 years to do things, and then suddenly you are out and the other side takes over, and in many ways is I guess my question is are liberal democracies losing to authoritarian states right now when you think the whole geopolitical system around the world?
To a degree, they are, and it's interesting to ask it that way because it allows us to kind of think about the values that are kind of at play here. Much of what is behind the tariffs, much of what is behind Trump's antagonism of our traditional allies, is the idea that this is how a tough man behaves and operates. You demand rather than cooperate. You use fear. You never acknowledge that you did something wrong. You never backtrack, or if you do backtrack, you claim that it's only because everybody else capitulated to you. And this kind of goes to, among the American right wing, there are these stereotypes about who cares what those sissy Europeans say. You think I'm going to let an Italian guy with a tight, slim fit suit tell me how we're going to run things here? It's these stereotypes and these images of, the French and their stinky cheese are going to tell us how. It's this type of extraordinarily, kind of pedestrian thinking that informs a lot of the way that Donald Trump operates. And it's terrifying. It's humiliating, truly. But when you see that those are the virtues and values that seem to be how you identify strength in the current Republican Party, a lot of this behavior starts to make a lot more sense in the short term. In the long term, it's a disaster. But in the short term, you start to understand why the current administration would behave in this way.
And to be fair, everybody in Europe hates the French too, so it's a
I
fair
love the French.
assessment.
I've had a great time in France every time I've been.
Okay. Well, there are few. Uh, so I mean, it's a kind of a strange situation if you look at what's going on in the U.S. As I've said maybe 7 times during this conversation. But when we look at Trump, he basically has these two big uh, groups that are kind of whispering to his ear. One would probably be the Heritage Foundation, and the other one would be the tech billionaires, the I don't know, the dystopian, who want to build these freedom cities and so on. um, how do you see this kind of struggle? Do you think there's a struggle behind the scenes between these two groups, or are there more groups? And what's going on? Like, and who does Trump listen to right now?
The last question's easy. Trump often listens to whoever speaks to him 5 minutes before he says something publicly. That's the sad, unfortunate, reality. There's the perception of some cracks right now, but I would argue that they're not really ideological cracks, they're self-serving cracks. So, for example, Elon Musk has come out and said he actually wants zero tariffs. One of the co-founders of Home Depot, whose name I forget, but he's a big Trump donor, he has come out and said the tariffs are bullshit. You're starting to see these anecdotes. It's not because they're against authoritarianism. It's not because they're morally opposed to the deportations. It's because this stuff is starting to affect their businesses or their bottom line. When the stock market drops 3% a day, very quickly, people who love the deportations are going to say, I don't know about this whole thing. So I think the point is we're only 3 months in. I don't think it's too soon to expect, I think, real abandonment of Trump by Republicans. Maybe it will come, maybe it won't. But the cracks you're starting to see are very much like what's happening to my wallet type of cracks. And even some influencers, like there's this guy, Dave Portnoy, who runs Barstool Sports and has been a supporter of Trump's. He even said, listen, when I think he's worth a couple $100 million. He said, when my stock account drops 3% a day, all of a sudden I'm open to voting for Democrats, right? And so I think that is precipitating what you're seeing.
Yeah, that's probably the reason why it's like tariffs off, tariffs on, tariffs off, and like it's just all this like 90-day pause. And um, to me, it seems like they have no clue what they're doing, or Trump doesn't have any clue what he's doing. Uh, but do you think there's a coherent strategy behind all this, or are they just guesstimating and doing these wild swings at whoever? Because when I th- I still believe this theory that the tariff system, the initial tariff system, was created with ChatGPT or something like, because
Yeah.
it was so crazy. It was absolutely crazy, and even the parameters they put inside there, they just kind of neutralize each other. So it was like high school math done with ChatGPT. But do you think there's a strategy behind all this?
I think there's an idea of what the strategy is. It doesn't work economically, but I think the idea from Trump was we put
Concept of a
tariffs.
strategy.
I'm sorry?
Concept of a
Concept of a
strategy.
strategy. Exactly. The concept of a strategy was we do big, strong tariffs on everybody. And then all of a sudden, they will either drop all of their tariffs on American goods if they have them, or we move the supply chains back home, manufacturing comes back, GDP goes up because now we're manufacturing everything domestically. I think that maybe Trump genuinely believed that. Now, of course, we know that moving some of these supply chains can take a decade. We know that it will cost significantly more to do so because of the cost of American labor. We know that we have 50 years of policy in the United States that was based on the idea that we prefer the cheap stuff from abroad rather than making it domestically. So it doesn't work in practice. So is it a coherent strategy? No, I know the economic principle that Trump was leaning on. It doesn't function in 2025. Maybe it did in 1870 when Trump says tariffs, we didn't even have an income tax because we had tariffs. Maybe it would have worked 50 years ago before offshoring everything, but it's not a coherent economic strategy today.
Yeah, I read somewhere that every 100 year, the United States tries some kind of tariff system and it always fails. So now is the time to try it again, and it fails, and then you go back to the free market system instead of mercantilism or whatever you want to call it.
Well, what's interesting about that is, one of the things that's come up in the opposition to tariffs by many on what we call the political left is, so is the left for or against free trade? Are tariffs good or bad? And what I've kind of likened it to is tariffs are a tool. It's sort of like if you told me, hey, David, I have a hammer. Is the hammer good? And I would say, well, if you have nails to nail in, it's a useful tool. If you're trying to, bake a cake, the hammer is not the right tool. I can see a role for saying we get a lot of our semiconductors from Taiwan. If China invades Taiwan, they could immediately say, we're not sending any semiconductors to the United States. They destroy many industries. That's a risk. Good. Let's on-ramp tariffs over the next 6 years, subsidize manufacturing semiconductors domestically, and that would be a surgical use of a tariff for a specific goal. That's very different than what's been done. So for me, it's not about tariff good, tariff bad. It's really the implementation.
Yeah, and I mean, Europe has been using tariffs against Chinese electric vehicles for a long time because they would have destroyed the
Right.
European car industry. So I think, but again, like going back to car industry, that is something like you putting tariffs on Canada that will destroy the American car industry, right? Because
Yeah.
basically, someone told me that. There's so much movement across the border. So you take one part to Canada and it's built like they do something about it, and then they take it back to America, to the
That's
United
right.
States, and then they do something, and it just goes back and forth. So, and all of this they put tariff on, and it
That's right.
just destroys the American auto industry and also, of course, Canadian one.
And what's
So
also remarkable about that is that during Trump's first term, he bragged about how he replaced NAFTA with something called USMCA. And USMCA was actually very similar to NAFTA. But one of the things that USMCA did is it created an alliance for vehicles with Canada, the US, and Mexico. And the idea actually was, we're not going to punish for building cars outside the US as long as it's Canada or Mexico. The idea was, together we will build cars. The companies that did what USMCA was meant to encourage them to do now will suffer because of the new tariffs. In other words, Trump is punishing people who modified their supply chain based on his first term's trade deal with the tariffs of the second term. It's a disaster.
There is absolutely no consistency. Um, there was a Finnish journalist or a Finnish op-ed that said that Trump is not playing 4D chess. He doesn't really have a good strategy. He's just old and simply he has become almost like demented and stupid.
I saw that piece. I saw that piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's your view on this?
Listen, I have been concerned about Trump's cognitive state for years at this point. And if you look at a rally from 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 6 years ago, you see that his speech has deteriorated significantly. He becomes less articulate and with a more limited vocabulary. I'm not a medical professional. I just observe that. Fine. We are seeing reports from economists who are now saying, we think he might be insane. There doesn't really seem to be an economic justification for what he's doing. There doesn't seem to be a business justification or a national security justification. So it's been a growing narrative in the United States. I think that's as far as I could kind of responsibly address it.
Yeah, you don't want to get a lawsuit. Maybe there should be like an upper limit for a person who can become the president, or I don't know, even a senator. I mean, Biden was like, it was so clear to me. It was evident, and everybody was trying to hide it, but you could see that there was a massive cognitive decline with Biden, and I just feel like it's when you listen to Trump ramble on a topic, it just goes somewhere, and he calls it the weave or
Yeah,
something, the weave. But it just sounds like, my grandpa is telling a story and just goes from one place to another, and it just doesn't sound coherent or doesn't make any sense.
it doesn't.
So that's I just think he's basically gone, and it's just other people basically telling him what to do, and then he maybe forgets and does something else. And but I think it's pretty bad for the United States. I think that's my take.
I agree with that.
Um, but there for many years there has been this kind of talk that world is becoming more multipolar. So the United States is no longer the biggest superpower, the dominating superpower in the world. Uh, and China is growing, but of course they also have a lot of problems like the demographics and so on. But if you take out a crystal ball, and 5 years from now, where do you see all this going? Or 4 years, like the end of Trump presidency, hopefully, end of his
My
presidency.
view for a little while now has been that American presidency aside, it seems, I don't want to say irreversible, but very likely that the direction of multipolarity is going to continue. And part of it is just kind of a numbers game. I mean, the belief is that ultimately global population will start to decline, but it's not happening yet. And as global population increases, how can one or two countries be the ultimate superpowers indefinitely? I mean, just from a population basis, it does seem that a multipolar world is likely. Now, we are also seeing how quickly these things can develop. In, for example, Trump puts these nuclear tariffs on China, and he's waiting around for China to call and say, we're ready to negotiate. And meanwhile, China's doing new trade deals with South Korea, and China is now talking to South America. And so, even before our eyes over the last 90 days, we are seeing how quickly these new poles of influence can kind of develop and grow. And I actually think that the US can still be an economically successful country, even in that space, maybe not necessarily with this tariff regime. But the point here is it seems that a lot of different factors, population factors, geopolitical, etc., are pointing in the direction of multipolarity.
Yeah, and if you look at it, Trump is creating these unbelievable friendships of between China and Japan, Vietnam, and it's like, okay, nobody expected this to happen ever. No, like China and Japan agreeing on something or even having discussions. So it's just there's he's really shaking the whole geopolitical landscape. But I I fear that it's also it brings out this rise of authoritarianism, and it kind of enables Russia to bounce back from their invasion of Ukraine, but also it provides China to opportunity to invade Taiwan and so on. So I actually think that we are closer to World War III now than we've ever been to. So I feel like the U.S. could start, U.S. and Israel could start some operation like military operations in Iran, possibly. China is definitely looking at Taiwan now with the sanctions coming in, because the sanctions will hurt them long term. So now might be the time, and Russia is probably ramping up their invasion of Ukraine, and potentially even Europe, even NATO countries, maybe like special operations. But I don't know. Do you agree with this statement?
So I think two things can be true. One, I think we are closer to World War III than maybe we have been for a long time. And I also still think the most likely outcome is we don't get World War III. So in the sense that we can be closer but still far. And that might be naive optimism. But one of the things that, there are scholars who believe that as the stakes become higher in terms of what civilization has to lose, the more natural a disincentive that is for such a global conflict. And I'm sympathetic to that idea, but at the same time, you can have irrational actors. And to a degree, Trump is irrational. To a great degree, Trump is irrational. You can have irrational actors that don't consider the stakes necessarily. And so I do think that there are those risks, and I still maintain cautious optimism that we're actually not as close as some might lead us to believe.
Um, so you probably with your book you've done a tour around the states, right? You've
It's really been a digital tour. I have not I it's not been an in-person tour, but I've been on, dozens of different shows.
Okay, but do you think, like, when you look at the American political landscape, social media, and so on, do you see any positive signals like optimism in the future?
Here's one. For years, the right wing independent media space grew much faster than the left wing independent media space. In the first quarter of this year, left wing YouTube grew about 40% faster than right wing YouTube. Now, great, that's great for David Pakman, right? Yes, no, of course, it's great to see that. But this has never been the case. And so something does seem to have happened with this last election where a lot of people tuned out because they were understandably depressed and despondent after November 5th. And as they are re engaging, as they see the rule of law being ignored and the deportations and all of this, they're tuning back in to something a little different, something I'm a part of. And that combined with the crowds that Bernie Sanders and AOC are getting, the totality of that, I think, is something to be at least a little optimistic about.
Okay, yeah, we just have to hope that the checks and balances still remain
That's right.
in the near future. Uh, Any final thoughts? I think it's I really love this, enjoyed this discussion. I would love to hear if you have any final thoughts, or if you want to kind of promote your book, or whatever you want to do.
No, listen, I'm a huge fan of yours, so this has been great. You know, I've been following you on X now for a long time, and I think I follow you. You're on Blue Sky as well, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I follow you on Blue Sky as well. The Vatnik soup, I think, is fantastic. I enjoy reading the profiles of, you know, those voices that you are warning us about, and this has just been really great.
Yeah, we have to do it again, right?
Absolutely.